Welcome to a meeting of Alive and Well, which is more than this night in this room and those of us gathered this evening. Just got back from an amazing event in Concord, Massachusetts, where I was invited to speak for at the Concord School of Philosophy and American Literature. It's beautiful there, and there were a lot of very open-minded scholars and professors and students, and it was a really beautiful experience. There's people all over the world who are discussing this issue and investigating these questions and looking for answers and real understanding as to what HIV and AIDS really mean and how they should be affecting people's lives and what's the best way to deal with this on a personal level and a global level. And just to give a little bit of background, Alive and Well is an organization that I started with a group of friends back in 1995, and it started out as my personal search for answers and understanding after having tested positive myself in 1992. When I tested positive back then, they didn't say start the drugs. As a matter of fact, I was told not to take anything because I was too healthy. I had 1,700 T cells inexplicably, and I say inexplicably because I had suffered for a number of years from the side effects of a medication I was given for misdiagnosis that had nothing to do with HIV or AIDS, but had actually made me immune suppressed. So it was interesting, and I was just getting over that immune suppression because of the medication I was taking when I was told I had tested HIV positive and I could expect to become immune suppressed, but not now because I was too healthy. So back then I was pretty much left on my own, and the thing that I did was I just couldn't sit still with the idea to wait until I became sick and then I could start taking drugs. So I started looking around to what I could do to save my good health that they were telling me I had, and I ended up at a bookstore buying a book on, it was an encyclopedia of vitamins, minerals, and supplements. And that led to a health plan that I adopted, and eventually to a medical doctor who was holistic and thought that my health plan was excellent and that I should retest. She said I didn't fit the profile of an AIDS patient, which was really weird because she was also seeing my ex-boyfriend, who I discovered tested positive. But she insisted that I retest, which I did, and my results came back indeterminate, followed by a positive, followed by a negative, followed by a positive. And that's what got me looking into other information about this. And it's been, in January it'll be 15 years since I tested positive. I've never taken any of the drugs. I've lived through a poisonous spider bite, being bit by a wild squirrel, one bout of pneumonia that I had at the same time as my HIV-negative brother, who's 5 years younger than me and an incredible surfer and athlete, and his daughter. We all got pneumonia and we all got better, and none of us took any medications for it. 2 natural childbirths, both over the age of 40. And I, since testing positive, discovered that I don't necessarily agree with the medical mainstream with how illness and health is regarded, that I found a better way that I never thought I would to approach my health and maintain my health, which is things that increase health rather than just taking a pill for every ill. And a big turnaround for me. I had a tremendous amount of confidence and faith in doctors. And it was just through necessity that I lost that and found another way of living, which has served me very, very well. And it may not be for everyone, but I encourage people to at least check it out. And really what I'd like to discuss more than anything, the questions in the book, if you look at the first couple of pages, there's like a true-false quiz. And it asks about 10 common assumptions that everybody thinks are true about HIV and AIDS. And as a matter of fact, they're things that I used to teach people when I was a public speaker and an educator for AIDS Project Los Angeles and LA Shanti Foundation and Women at Risk. I thought they were absolutely true. And I was surprised myself to learn that they're not. And that there's a lot of information to substantiate ideas that at first glance people might think are really crazy, but actually they make a lot of sense. And so most of what I want to share with you this evening is about the notion that AIDS is a new disease. I think that's the first question in the book, and about HIV tests. because the only thing that turns a disease into AIDS, the only thing that takes a yeast infection or a bout of pneumonia out of the category of pneumonia or yeast infection is being assumed to be HIV positive. Other people can have those same problems in their pneumonia or a yeast infection or salmonella or toxoplasmosis, but if you're assumed to be HIV positive, those problems are called AIDS. And it's really important to think about that, because it's not just the words that are used to describe them, but it's what people expect because of those words that are placed on them as a label or a diagnosis, and the way a doctor will treat you. If you're somebody, say, in Africa, and you have a diagnosis of tuberculosis and you also test HIV positive, this is an extreme example, you're not given the TB medicine. Because if you're positive, no one has any hope that you'll survive to benefit from that medication. There's not enough to go around, so they give it to people who have the best chance of living. Here, it just means you're treated with a certain amount of medical prejudice. You're encouraged to believe that you might not get better. You're encouraged to believe that your life will be different from other people's, shorter and full of more diseases to come in the future. You're encouraged to believe that you need highly toxic medications to survive. And you're encouraged, unfortunately, just through the way this whole thing is set up, to regard yourself as danger to other people. Our legal system is set up so even consensual sex between people who are HIV positive and otherwise in some states is a crime. It's really quite a situation. So just going back to what I began to talk about, what is AIDS? Most people just off the street, if you ask them, they say, oh, it's a terrible disease. It's a disease where your immune system collapses. But it's gotten better now because they have these medications that make it a chronic, manageable condition. Everybody seems to think of AIDS as an it, when in fact AIDS isn't a condition, it's actually a category. And you get into that category by being assumed to be HIV positive, having tested HIV positive, and either being sick with one of the many conditions that are listed as AIDS officially in this country, or simply testing positive, not being sick, and having a T-cell count that is at 200 or less. A long time ago, when AIDS first came into being, so to speak, the government kind of defined it into being. They decided that a new name was needed to describe what was happening to young, mostly gay men in major urban areas around the country, and whatever they were suffering from needed to be described in a new way and understood in a new way, because what they were suffering from were old diseases, but that were unexpectedly happening to young people. And that's when the category of AIDS began. So there was never an illness called AIDS, which I'm sure most people know, but we forget about that sometimes when we think about curing it, the walk for it, fighting it, funding it, protecting yourself from it. It is a chronic, manageable condition now, supposedly. But it's really a category, and if you look a little further up in the book, it shows you some examples, like right there where you have that page open, there's a little chart in blue, and it shows, here I'll give you this too, pneumonia is pneumonia, except if you test positive, and then that pneumonia is AIDS. It has tuberculosis is AIDS if you have a positive HIV test, and if it's negative, you've got tuberculosis. And you can do that with all the AIDS-defining illnesses. Interestingly, AIDS was, in the 1980s, a condition of being very, very sick, right, with one of these primary AIDS-defining illnesses that are only called AIDS-defining illnesses when they happen to somebody who's assumed to be positive. Even sometimes it's stretched into if you're gay, if you're African. It doesn't even matter whether or not you've tested in many cases. But today, the number one cause of an AIDS diagnosis each year is not being sick. It's simply testing positive and having a T-cell count of 200 or less. At least half of all newly diagnosed AIDS cases in America are diagnosed among people who are not sick. They've simply tested positive and have a one-time only T-cell count is all you need to go into that AIDS category, which used to be someplace that was designated for people who were very, very sick with one of these defining illnesses.
Okay, what was GRID?
That was what they called AIDS before they called it AIDS. That stood for gay-related immune deficiency.
So basically, they blamed the gay, people for, making it up or something like that?
No, it was just, it manifested with some gastrointestinal disorders at first, so people thought it had something to do, it was called gay bowel syndrome, GBS. Then it became GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, and then it became everybody's disease, AIDS. But if you guys, have you seen the... I'll talk about that. If you can wait, you can eat more and I'll talk about that. But have you guys seen the new ad campaign from the Gay and Lesbian Center here in Los Angeles? It's quite controversial. It says, own it, end it. All these years, it's everybody's disease, it's everybody's disease. There was never any indication, epidemiologically speaking, that this was going to be or was something that could happen to anybody and would happen to everybody. But that campaign is really what made AIDS what it is today. Now the Gay and Lesbian Center here in Los Angeles is going back to saying it's a gay disease. Why are they doing this? 75% of people in LA County who get an AIDS diagnosis are gay men, which is kind of the way it's always been. But marketing dictated that if this was ever going to get attention and funding, it needed to be something that everybody was scared of, that everybody was concerned about. Otherwise, nobody was going to fund it to any great extent. And it was actually, you mentioned having seen the documentary film, The Other Side of AIDS. I don't know if you remember in it, there's an interview with a gay historian named Mark Conlon. And he talks about how at the very beginning of this, gay men in the PR industry got together, they did some focus group studies, and they figured out people were not going to fund this. People were not going to invest in research, and the government was not going to invest in research in what was going on that was being called AIDS unless it was perceived as everybody's problem. And that same film shows also a front page Wall Street Journal story in which it was acknowledged by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control that way back when they knew that this was going to remain within certain risk groups, but they had to go forward because it was never going to get any funding if it was portrayed that way. And here it is all these years later, and we're back to, it's interesting because that's a very bold move to say, well, hey, this is what's going on. We don't care what you guys are saying. The people who need to hear the message, they believe, and I'm sure they believe this in their hearts, are the people who are most affected, and we need to talk to them, and if you don't like it, oh well, because that's what's going on here in Los Angeles.
But I thought the highest risk group right now was African-American female.
That's what they say. That's what they say, but I really vigorously question that. There's so many estimates and projections about what's going to happen and who's most at risk, and then you look at the actual numbers every year, and it's kind of like, do you guys remember SARS? Yeah, remember that whole big thing about SARS? All these people are going to die from SARS. People were afraid to go anywhere, get on airplanes. I feel sorry for anyone who succumbed to the condition that was called SARS, but it was a very small number of people worldwide considering what was predicted. Then I don't know what's going on with the avian flu. That seems to have kind of petered away. And I was thinking about that today. Do you remember the killer bacteria that would eat your skin? Do you remember killer bees? And do you watch every year what happens, what comes up to be considered this time of year is flu season? Every year, someone is predicting this is going to be worse than the flu of 1818, the big flu epidemic that wiped out millions of people worldwide. Every year it happens, this prediction, and every year it doesn't happen. Nothing takes place that's even remotely close to what everybody's predicting. And so a lot of these things are empty predictions. In 1993, it was predicted that the African nation of Botswana would literally go extinct due to AIDS. 10 years later, 2003 census, it's got one of the fastest growing populations on the African continent. I mean, it's just remarkable. We hear about South Africa being the world's epicenter for AIDS. That's based on predictions and estimates. They say that there's some 5,600,000 HIV/AIDS people in South Africa. They have had less than 15,000 diagnosed cases of AIDS in that country since the UN AIDS began counting in 1981. They back counted. They've only come up with less than 15,000 cases. I think it's actually 12,800 and something. And people say, oh, well, that's because, African people don't want the stigma associated with AIDS if somebody in their family dies, so they say it's not AIDS. But if you look at overall mortality in South Africa, less than 1% of people, both sexes, ages 15 and over, of any cause, die each year. Less than 1%. That is an amazing mortality rate that's about equal to the United States, which is, we're considered a developed country. I don't know if that's emotionally or economically, but I would question whether that's politically developed. But in South Africa, which is considered, a developing area of the world, to have the same mortality rate or very similar to ours is quite a remarkable thing. And so it's hard to argue that there are people for all these numbers that they say when you don't see in census reports. There was a report recently by a South African actuarial company that noted that in the last 20 years, life expectancy there has increased by 7 years. So, we hear all these things, but is there something behind it other than very effective marketing? And those are some of the questions we raise here. So what I want to talk about is AIDS in relation to the test, which is known as an HIV test. And we're just kind of going to walk through this little handout that I made that somehow fell apart in my car. I think my son stepped on it. But we'll do our best. Here's one for you. And so, in just talking about this, I think everyone knows that AIDS is not a disease in and of itself. And an interesting way to think about that is in Canada, they don't have the same definition for AIDS as we do here in the U.S. And the primary cause of an AIDS diagnosis in the U.S. is not being sick and simply testing positive and having a T-cell count of 200 or less. That's AIDS here in the U.S. If you have that diagnosis of AIDS in the U.S., you can move to Canada and be cured of AIDS because they don't officially recognize the 200 T-cell count or less criteria. So what disease can you think of that's actually disease where you can get better by moving? I don't think there is one. And also, too, if you look in the book that I've given you this evening, you can go back and look at that. The definition of what we call AIDS here in this country has changed over the years. So what was AIDS one year is not AIDS in another year. And it's also interesting to note the two primary AIDS illnesses back at the very beginning were pneumocystis pneumonia and Kaposi's sarcoma. Kaposi's sarcoma has almost disappeared, and many years ago, I think it was about 13 years ago, Dr. Robert Gallo, the same guy who said he discovered the virus that supposedly causes AIDS, found the virus that supposedly causes KS, and it's not HIV. So every single one of those AIDS-defining illnesses is caused by something other than HIV. This is the only category of illness where everything in it is caused by something else. That's why anybody, positive or negative, can have an AIDS-defining illness but not have it called AIDS. So every single disease or condition in that AIDS category has a cause and a treatment well known for many, many years that has absolutely nothing to do with HIV. What I want to do is, because AIDS is only a category you end up in by virtue of the fact that someone believes you're HIV positive, that is someone who's an authority, a medical authority, let's take a look at HIV tests, because that's how you get there in most cases. A lot of people in developing areas of the world, though, are never tested. They give AIDS diagnoses by looking at them and saying, cough, fever, weight loss, AIDS. And it's of benefit to be that loose with diagnosing AIDS because there's no money for malaria, or relatively no money for malaria, very little money for tuberculosis in proportion to how many people suffer from that worldwide. not nearly enough money for food, water, basic medical care, and things people in developing areas of the world need. You get your funding through AIDS. So, they see a lot of AIDS, and I think that is something that makes it even harder to understand what's actually going on between the estimates and projections and assumptions and very loose diagnostic criteria. We really can't get a clear picture of what's happening in other parts of the world unless we go there and look around ourselves, which I personally have done, and it's quite different from what we've all been told. On this page here, this is some of the text from the screening test that we use here in the United States. This is the one that the U.S. government just said that every American between the ages of 13 and 64 should take when they go get their annual physical. And it's called an HIV antibody test, but it's very interesting to look at the fine print. Fine print is something I really like looking at. I just got a parking place here tonight, premium parking place, because I read the fine print on the sign. Like 6-8 people passed it up because they didn't read that the valet parking is only on Friday and Saturday nights. Fine print is very, very good to read. But this fine print on this test points out a few things. First of all, the screening test was designed to be extremely sensitive. What that means is it errs on the side of calling positive. It was designed that way to protect the blood supply. It was designed to protect the blood supply from any potential pathogen. It wanted to keep people safe, so it was made to be extremely sensitive. As a result, it says, non-specific reactions may be seen. That means that things that aren't specific to HIV may cause a reaction, which is what gets you a positive, is a reaction. Some of these are due to prior pregnancy, blood transfusion, or other exposure. That's a very broad category, other exposure. And there's a little brochure that when you first walked in, it's called 60 Reasons to Think Twice About Taking an HIV Test. This has some of those other exposures listed in it. You'd be surprised at, this is all footnoted from the medical literature, referenced in the medical literature, all those other exposures that have nothing to do with HIV that can cause a positive test result. And it can cause them over the course of a lifetime. Because nature gave us antibodies to keep around, to protect us. So we don't give them up very easily. So if you've got antibodies to something that is reactive, another exposure, this test can call a positive as if it were HIV antibody positive when it's another kind of antibody positive. It also says something very interesting that I almost get dizzy when I read this. It's so crazy. Here we have an antibody test, and it actually says on the antibody test, at present, there is no recognized standard for establishing the presence and absence of HIV antibody in human blood. Think about that a minute. It's an antibody test that says there's no way to tell if you have or don't have the antibody in your blood. Yet, it's an antibody test. What I think about when I see this is, I don't know how many people are familiar with the French surrealist painter Magritte. He would paint a shoe, and then underneath it would say in French, "This is not a shoe." That's called surrealism, surrealistic. This is a very surrealistic test. It doesn't really make logical sense. It also says something very concerning below that, as if that's not concerning enough. It says the test's sensitivity is based on two things, assumptions and estimates. And its specificity is also based on assumptions and estimates. Specificity and sensitivity put together equal accuracy. This test's accuracy is based on assumptions and estimates. So we have estimates and assumptions, and then we end up with a presumption. And the presumption is anybody who tests positive for the antibodies is presumed to have the virus. But this just said it can't even tell if the antibody's there. So that's your screening test. There are attorneys, finally, who are looking into this and wondering what the heck is going on, that these tests are being used when they carry these disclaimers that say they can't do what we're all believing they do. It's been a long time coming, but finally I think some responsible people are looking into this and wondering what the heck we're all doing. So that's a screening test. In some countries, in some settings, that's the only test you ever get. And very interestingly, in Africa, on the African continent, they derive a lot of their estimates as to what's going on in the general population by testing small groups of pregnant women. With a test that says due to prior pregnancy, you can get a positive reaction. On the African continent, the average woman has 5.5 pregnancies in her lifetime. So a lot of women having babies are going to have had babies previously and are going to be susceptible for that alone to a false positive, plus the fact that there's widespread exposure to malaria, tuberculosis, and other endemic illnesses that are on that list of 60 reasons. And you can see where these estimates come from. They're testing a susceptible population with the non-specific test and then using those numbers to project that out to everybody else. In this country, we get what's called a confirmatory test. But this confirmatory test isn't really a confirmatory test because all it does is test for antibody response to the exact same proteins that this one used. And none of these proteins are unique or specific to HIV. This one tests you for all the proteins put together and gives you a yes or no. Actually, you can have a strong positive, a mild positive, a moderate positive, but it's usually thrown into one category or the other, positive or negative. This spreads all your proteins out that are looked for and decides if you've had a reaction to each individual protein on the test. And depending on the pattern of reaction to those proteins, you'll be called positive, negative, or indeterminate. And it says here, the second to last sentence, that there's bands of interpretive significance, and these refer to certain proteins, and those are supposed to be the really important ones. If you make a positive antibody response to those proteins, those are supposed to be able to really tell you if you're positive or not. In the book that I gave you, you'll see a little chart that shows this takes the various proteins and puts them over here, and it shows you how different countries and different agencies within our own country have different criteria for what a positive test is. There's a different banding pattern that each one of these countries and agencies considers a positive result. There's no universal standard for what a positive test result is on a Western blot, which is what we're looking at, the so-called confirmatory test. No standard from lab to lab, country to country, agency to agency, and perhaps even day to day. I actually had the experience of testing positive, negative, and indeterminate at the same lab on different days. This is something that gives you an idea. This is, it asks which viral bands of interpretive significance indicate a positive Western blot. The same sample is interpreted differently by the various countries and institutions noted on this chart. So let's say somebody registers positive for GP120, P51, and P31. What would that mean? Well, it depends. If you're in Australia or France, it's not a positive. In the UK, it would be, as it would be in Germany. The World Health Organization says, no, that's not a positive. And here in the US, it depends on who's reading your test. And the way your test is read, to a certain extent, depends on the motivation of the agency reading it. We talked about how the blood banks, the Red Cross, needed to protect the blood supply, and so a very sensitive test was invented for them. The Red Cross says, yes, this is a positive. Why? Their motivation is to protect the blood supply. But right underneath is the DOD, Department of Defense. They say, no, that's not a positive, because their motivation, as many new recruits as possible. They don't want to err on the side of caution and turn people away. They want people in the military. So two different motivations, two different ways of reading the test result. On the next page, you see something, and it's a question. Are viral bands of interpretive significance consistent from lab to lab? This was a study that sent one confirmed positive sample, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, their standard for positive. One positive sample was sent to 525 different labs for evaluation, and look what happened. Some labs, they're evenly divided almost, or they disagree to one extent or another as to which proteins are present, affecting how this test would be read. If this was the same person, depending on where their test was being read, they would have different results. This could represent 525 people's lives, and it's all kind of up for grabs because there's no agreement, as you can see here, as to which proteins showed up consistently at these labs. This is another study that was done, and this is from 1991, and people look at that date and they go, oh, well, you know, this is old. They've improved things a lot since then. No, they use the same proteins on these tests, and they've never funded another study where they tried to do this confirmation of a test's ability to reproduce itself correctly, to get the same result each time. In this study, one confirmed positive sample by Western blot, according to FDA standards, was sent to the same lab. It was a reference lab, where persons reading the test results must have at minimum a PhD. You can't have worked at Taco Bell and then go there and be reading people's test results. You have to have at minimum a PhD. They knew that their site was going to receive a positive sample. This one was sent 44 different times over the course of several months, and look how many different ways it was read. The same sample, the same lab, with the highest standards for evaluation. And it was read one time with it didn't even have any reactive bands. Another time, 5 times, the only reactive band that showed up was P24. 2 times it was P24 and P31. 10 times there were 3 reactive proteins, and 26 times there were 4. And it's the same sample going to the same lab. So when people talk about reproducibility, you know, they haven't tried to do a study again like that since 1991 after that resounding failure, and it seems like that would be really important to do. When you talk about this, people say, oh, well, what about the latest HIV tests? They don't resolve the problem. Currently, there are no HIV tests that have actually been approved by the FDA for the specific intended purpose of diagnosing infection with HIV. For example, the literature for the Oraquick Test, which you can see on the next page, states it is intended to be used as a point-of-care test to aid in the diagnosis of infection with HIV. Look, the word diagnosis, infection, and test aren't, this is a test for the diagnosis of HIV infection. There's a lot of extra words that were put in here by highly paid legal advisors and the people at the company that makes this test, so that they're not telling you this is a test for diagnosing HIV infection. They're saying it's intended to be used as a point-of-care test to aid in the diagnosis of infection with HIV. I like to think of a point-of-care test that is similar to this. It can give you a reading, but it can't tell you what the reading is about, what it's coming from, what it really means. That's a thermometer. That's a point-of-care test that a doctor can use to aid in giving you a diagnosis. A thermometer will give you a reading, 98.6, 99.2, 93.1, whatever. Can't tell you what's causing that. What's causing that? And these tests are similar. They really can't tell you that HIV is causing this reading. The latest HIV tests don't claim that HIV is proved, demonstrated, or known to cause AIDS. Instead, the Oraquick characterizes HIV as a virus thought to cause AIDS, while other tests describe HIV as a virus correlated with AIDS. So nobody's saying HIV, not on these test kits, and the literature is very carefully constructed by highly paid attorneys working together with the executives of these diagnostic firms. They're not going out on any limbs. They're not saying HIV is the cause of AIDS. They're being very careful, and I think we need to ask why. Another point to consider when asking if the latest HIV tests are any better, the proteins used in the latest tests are the same as those used in the original HIV ELISA, which was that one we saw at the very beginning of this discussion, the one that says that it's presumed and estimated to do this and that. They're the same proteins that were used for the first test created in the mid-1980s. The Oraquick Test literature cites the 1984 work of Dr. Robert Gallo as proof of HIV isolation, when in fact, we know Dr. Robert Gallo was unable to isolate HIV from the cell culture that was sent to him by the French scientist. And that French scientist in 1997 said, despite Roman efforts, we were unable to purify, which means isolate, HIV. How many people know about the big debacle between the American scientist who claimed he had discovered the probable cause of AIDS in 1984 and the French scientist who said, wait a minute, he took my cell culture and said that he found the virus in that, but that's my cell culture. Do you guys remember that? It's kind of, back there in history. But what resulted in that is our president at that time, Ronald Reagan, had to meet with the French president, and they had to negotiate a settlement that gave these two scientists rights to the, quote, discovery of HIV, but neither of them had discovered HIV. And what they actually share is the patent rights on the antibody test kit, which uses proteins that did not come from a purified isolate of HIV, which is the only thing that those proteins have to come from if the test is actually going to be specific and sensitive and therefore accurate.
So they can't actually test for virus on the antibodies?
No. And you wouldn't have to. You don't need to test for a virus as long as you validated your viral antibody test kit by doing a study in which you take a group of people, let's say 1,000 people who've tested positive on your antibody test. Out of those 1,000 people, you see how many you can directly isolate the actual virus from. If it's all 1,000, your test is 100% accurate. If it's 999, it's 99.9% accurate, and so on. That very basic, simple, responsible study has never been conducted. No one has ever tried to validate HIV tests by the direct isolation of HIV from people who test positive, or conversely, failed to isolate directly the virus from people who test negative. So we would know its sensitivity and its specificity, and those two things add up to accuracy. So when you hear 99.9% and so forth, those are estimates and assumptions, and they're not even reproducible results, as those two studies show. Here's the Oraquick test with those things that I mentioned underlined. And this test kit literature is very difficult to get a hold of. Any of you seeing doctors, you might want to ask if you can get a hold of this, because it's very interesting to look at. It says that, as we mentioned, the test is intended for use as a point-of-care test to aid in the diagnosis of infection with HIV. It's not saying it diagnoses you with it. And also, too, it says that here it is, HIV is thought to cause, or AIDS is thought to be caused by HIV, not proven, demonstrated, known, thought. I think a lot of things. Doesn't mean they really happened. Thank goodness. And it also says HIV has been isolated. Why do they say that? They're citing 1984 and 1985 studies that have to do with Robert Gallo, who was caught and investigated by the U.S. Congress for having swiped the cell culture from the French guy who said, despite Roman efforts, we didn't isolate anything from this. Isn't it amazing that, where's Bono on this? It just is so surprising to me. And people say, oh, well, the viral load test, that puts this whole discussion to rest, because viral load, you're testing for the load of the virus. How much is there? I used to work in advertising and marketing, and I know a lot of what the power of a name, like a Whopper. Doesn't mean it's the biggest hamburger you ever saw. It just sounds good. And when you're hungry, I want a Whopper. Sounds big. Viral load. That sounds good. That sounds like it's going to measure your load of virus. It's just a name. It's just a marketing name, like a Whopper or a, Suckmaster vacuum cleaner. It's a name. But look what the test actually says it does and doesn't do. Not intended to be used as a screening test for HIV or as a diagnostic test to confirm the presence of HIV infection. Once again, we have a test that's a bit surrealistic. It's a test that's supposed to tell you your viral load, but it says it's not intended to be used for confirming the presence of HIV. Well, how are you going to get a load out of that? Well, a load of virus anyway. But moving along. So why are these tests being used? Viral load tests, why were they approved for use? Well, they weren't approved as diagnostic tests for diagnosing actual HIV infection. They were approved as prognostic tests. Prognosticate means to predict or foretell a future outcome. So they were approved as prognostics. And this little chart here shows what that's based on. In the study that approved viral load testing, it had four groups of people. We can divide them up like this. The people with the lowest viral loads are at the top, and those with the highest viral loads are at the bottom. And this was supposed to be proving itself to be a good test to predict progression to disease. Not to diagnose actual infection, but predict progression to disease. So here we have the people with the lowest viral loads, and it predicted disease progression 60% of the time. Not terribly impressive. People with the highest viral loads, it predicted their progression to disease 50% of the time. If you take a coin and flip it over and over and over again, pretty soon you'll get to the point of 50-50 odds. That's just random chance. We had to do that experiment in high school in biology. We spent the whole period flipping pennies just so we learned that if you do it enough, you hit that point of 50-50 odds. This test is hardly any better. If you can only predict 60% of the time people with the highest, 50% of the time people with the highest viral loads progressing to disease, and 60% of the time people with the lowest viral loads progressing to disease, that's not much better than a random coin flip. And if you go back to what we were looking at before, how often the same positive sample was correctly identified as positive going to the same lab, that was 58% of the time, which is once again not much better than the odds you get by flipping a coin. And people's lives are hinging on these tests that don't do what they say they can do, or they actually don't say they can do what we think they do if you look closely enough, and their ability to predict is not much better than flipping a coin. This is from a study that was examined by a group of researchers whose website is down at the bottom of the page, the Perth group. And what this study did is it took people, these are the people here where it says HIV strain, and it gave them different brands of viral load tests. And that goes across here. And what you see is this. The same people's blood subjected to different brands of viral load tests get different results. And not just by a little bit, by quite a significant amount. 400 to 111,000 is quite a significant difference. And I like to think of it like this. If you have a finite, definite amount of something, say like an amount of money in the bank, if you go to the ready teller, if you walk into the branch, or if you phone the 24-hour automated teller, you're going to get that same amount given to you, whether it's by the ready teller, in person at the branch, or over the telephone. If you think of these three viral load testing methods as the ready teller, walking into the branch, and the toll-free 800 number, they should all be giving you the same amount if, in fact, that amount is there. And look what happens. I would love to go to the ready teller and find $184,500 when actually my account only has $400 in it. I mean, where else would we put up with this? Under what other circumstances would this be okay? It's really hard to imagine. I don't even know if that's all that interesting, but I threw my own viral load tests in here just for the heck of it. I took a viral load test in 1996 when they first came out, just because they cost $10. They were doing something down at a lab in San Diego to encourage this whole, adoption of the viral load testing, which if you have been paying attention to news, the new news is viral load cannot serve as a reliable predictor of either T-cell counts or health. That's the latest news coming from the AIDS mainstream. It was brought to us, I think, first by British news, and now it's hit the United States. So what is known and what's been said for a long, long time is finally, after all these years, being recognized. It's actually, I think it was 96 96 is when viral load first came out as the state of the art. Here it is 2006, and they're like, whoops. All those people we told to take drugs because we thought this was a great predictive tool, oops, sorry, it's not. It's proving not to be. And what a surprise. Why not? It never has been. Not even from the day it was approved. But in 96, I went down to this lab in San Diego, and my first test result was 359,000 viral load. If you go back and look at the approval studies that approved this test in 96, I was off the charts. That's how high my viral load was. I didn't know because I didn't go back and pick up my results for 3 weeks. So I didn't know I was off the charts. I went back 3 weeks later and took another one, and my results were 980. I went from 359,000 to 980, having done nothing except drive to San Diego twice. So of course my joke is, want to get a lower viral load? Drive to San Diego. And in both cases, I was me and I was fine, and, nothing happened. What's also happened in 1996 is a whole new class of drugs got approved based on their ability to affect viral load numbers. And here are some of these drugs now that are out. Kaletra doesn't say, this drug can help you be healthier, keep infections away. It says, it changes your numbers, basically. It says still undetectable, still in control. That's one of those advertising things. Still undetectable, still in control. If you look at the fine print for Kaletra on the next page where I've underlined, it says that the long-term effects are not known, and people taking this drug may still get the opportunistic infections that they're taking this drug to avoid getting. And those specific infections include pneumonia, herpes, and mycobacteria. Those are the very infections that you're taking the drugs to avoid, and the drug says it can't help you avoid those. Gee, but it can do all kinds of other things, like cause terrible side effects that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Here's another drug, Emtreva. Does it say Emtreva will protect you from illness? It will give you a longer, healthier life? No, it's convenient, tolerable, powerful, and it can keep you covered from dose to dose. And its efficacy is based on HIV-1 RNA levels, that's viral load. Those tests look for genetic materials like RNA and DNA, but it doesn't say it can keep you healthy or anything else. If you look at the underlined information on the back, long-term effects are not known. People taking it can still get the opportunistic infections, specifically pneumonia, herpes, and mycobacteria. Are you noticing something? They all have to say the same thing. Okay, here we have Viramune. Does Viramune say it will keep you healthy, living longer? No. It says it's the power to suppress viral load. Twice daily dosing, generally well tolerated, no food restrictions. Viramune, taking on tomorrow. Okay, on the back, what does it say? It's not known if it will help you live longer. People taking Viramune may still get the infections they're taking it to prevent. And they don't go into the specifics, but there you go. Now, what's interesting to me about these drugs, and we'll talk in a minute about the side effects, is there's another class of drugs out there that can change numbers but can't affect your health outcome, apparently. Here's Crestor. People take this to lower their cholesterol numbers. It lowers their numbers, but what does Crestor say? It's not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. Why else do you want to lower your cholesterol level except to prevent heart disease and heart attacks? Especially when you can get all kinds of terrible side effects like we've seen with these lipid drugs. Crestor says that. Changes your numbers, doesn't affect your health outcome. Here's Welchol. It will lower your cholesterol, but, as underlined there, Welchol has not been shown to prevent heart disease or heart attacks. And I'll admit, I picked up a People magazine today when I was at the market. I love to look for these ads. The latest ads say, not only do these drugs not prevent heart disease and heart attacks, they don't prevent strokes either. They've added that. So all these people all over the country are taking these with the idea that lowering their cholesterol will prevent heart attacks and strokes and heart disease. That's not what the drug says it's going to do. It's just going to lower those numbers. So here's Magic Johnson, looking up at God maybe. It's a very religious picture. Well understood profile, durable efficacy, dosing convenience, favorable safety and tolerability profile. Combivir, okay? What do we learn about Combivir? It says, boldly, contains 2 medicines proven to help people with HIV live longer, healthier lives. Finally, a drug that says it's proven to help people live longer, healthier lives. Not just change your numbers. Why do they say that? It used to be that if you said something like that, you had to have an asterisk next to that claim and then cite a study right on the back page. In the free-for-all known as the modern world, that's no longer required. Instead, it says on the back, people taking Combivir may still develop infections, etc., etc. But why can they say that? When I called GlaxoSmithKline, is that the manufacturer? Yes. This drug, they directed me to their website. And this is what you see about Combivir. The first thing, this big black box warning. That's the highest level warning a drug gets when it's so very toxic that they need to warn you right away of some of the worst things that can happen in what's called a black box. So you can see that one of the 2 active ingredients in Combivir has been associated with hematological toxicity. That means blood toxicity, including neutropenia, severe anemia, particularly in patients with what they call advanced HIV disease. The very people who are supposed to be benefiting from these drugs are those most at risk of suffering the most severe black box warning side effects. It also says that it can cause lactic acidosis and severe I'm not even going to try to say that's liver stuff, including fatalities, okay? So this is not exactly what Magic Johnson said, but they still make that claim. So is Combivir proven to help people with HIV live longer, healthier lives? Well, here, let's take a look at health. Here's some important safety information about the side effects. Redistribution of body fat, including central obesity, dorso-cervical fat enlargement, otherwise known as buffalo hump, peripheral wasting, facial wasting, breast enlargement, something awful appearance, headache, nausea, malaise, fatigue. There's probably also, if you look closer, there's anemia, there's, I'm sure, diarrhea, vomiting, nausea, and so forth. So why are they saying it's proven to help people with HIV live longer, healthier lives? Let's look at the longer, because clearly it's not really healthier. Here's the study that they cite. It's called the Caesar study. It was never published in the medical literature. That's a problem. It's an in-house study. And here's what it's all about. This is their chart. They compared 3 groups of patients. HIV positives by test, or we don't even know how they were diagnosed positive, taking their current therapy, whatever the heck that is. They were compared to people, a group of HIV positives taking whatever the heck they were taking, plus one of the ingredients in Combivir. The third group is people taking whatever the heck they were taking, plus one of the ingredients in Combivir, plus an experimental drug that's not approved in the United States and not named here. Okay? So do you see a comparison between any of these groups and people who are HIV positive like me and not taking anything at all? No. That's called a placebo study. when you compare your drug in people who have the problem the drug is supposed to help, some of whom are taking the drug and some of whom are not, preferably equally divided people who have many factors in common. Okay, that's a good study. That used to be called ethical. Today that's called unethical. We don't have studies that test any AIDS drugs in HIV positives who are taking and not taking the drug in question, because that today, what used to be considered ethical, is now unethical to do that. So they just compare people taking anything the heck they're taking plus anything the heck plus one of the ingredients in this drug Combivir, plus anything plus one ingredient plus a drug that's never been approved that they don't even tell us the name of or where the heck it came from. Yeah, that would be called a control group. That would be. It used to be, but we see that a lot of what we assume and what used to be true is not in the lovely world of HIV and AIDS. What's the greatest difference in death here? The first group, 5.9% of people died, 2.6% in the second group, 3.0% in the third group. So the greatest difference is between 5.9 and 2.6. Does anybody good at math that can figure out what that is? That's 3.3% is the greatest difference between the two groups. In medical and scientific studies where they're doing drug testing, that low percentage difference between your treatment group that you're looking at as saying this is successful and your other group, that low percentage is considered statistically insignificant. Maybe that's why this study was never published in the medical literature. Because if it were, somebody might go, hey, that's statistically insignificant. Plus, what the heck is that other drug that you use that's not approved in the United States and isn't even named? And what the heck does current therapy mean anyway? And I get the sense that current therapy, considering that was 62% of the patients on current therapy were taking AZT alone, that hasn't been allowed in this country since 1996. So this is clearly something that did not occur in the United States. And once we leave the United States, we leave the setting that we can all relate to, where people have enough food and water and basic medical care to relate to our lives. So, is it really fair to say Combivir is proven to help people with HIV live longer, healthier lives? And what is up with Magic Johnson anyway? Here's Magic Johnson in another ad. Remember that real serious one where he's looking up at God about his Combivir? Look at him here. Magic Johnson isn't touching Combivir. There's no quotes around, I take Combivir. I mean, this is interesting to me, because here he is holding a natural immune support product. His signature is on the ad. He's smiling. He's touching it. Okay, it was photoshopped in, but he allowed that to happen. There's a quote from him, I use my defense to guard my health because it promotes healthy immunity functions and offers everyday immune enhancement. Irvin Magic Johnson. Isn't that interesting? I wonder which one he takes. Does he take Combivir or does he take this? He's a very healthy guy. Another thing I wanted to point out here is that in the cocktail combinations are the old drugs, AZT, DDI, 3TC. Those all are designed as chemotherapy drugs, as in cancer. They're designed to destroy growing cells in a body rather randomly. That's what cancer chemotherapy does. It destroys growing cells. Why? Because when you have cancer, you have too many rapidly growing cells. That's what cancer is. So you blast people with chemotherapy, and it stops that process. You let them recover. You blast them again. It stops, and and then you hope that they make it through that process, and that the healthy cells go back, and the cancer doesn't. One of the dangers of cancer chemotherapy is by killing off your cells at random, you're susceptible to all kinds of infection. And this is an ad from People magazine. It says, I have cancer, but what nearly killed me started as a simple infection. It says, did you know that while chemotherapy destroys cancer cells, it also destroys your ability to fight off infections? That's because it kills your white blood cells, otherwise known as T cells, right? What's the difference between cancer chemotherapy called cancer chemotherapy and cancer chemotherapy called AZT? It's we go back to marketing and those choices of names we give things. There's no difference. There's no appreciable difference. AZT was designed as a potential cancer chemotherapy. It destroys growing cells and leaves you vulnerable to infection, just as cancer chemotherapy does. But when people take it every day in their combinations, they're not getting blasted and then a chance to recover. Every day is a blast. A lesser blast, but a blast nonetheless. And here's another thing from People magazine. It's the magazine of the people. How many people read the Journal of the American Medical Association? How many people read, Nature Biology? We read this, and you can find all kinds of stuff in here. This past week I found some famous guy. I don't watch television, so I don't even know who he is. That he and his brothers all grew up with constant pneumonia. He said he had pneumonia like 6 times in his life where he had to be hospitalized. You do that today, you're HIV positive or you're gay or you're African, guess what you have? You have AIDS, you don't have pneumonia. I just think it's interesting to look at these things in that context. But here's an interesting article about an interesting book, The Truth About Drug Companies. And, drug companies, contrary to what we might believe by looking at the people who represent them in their white coats, these are not necessarily good guys. They're companies, and they have an allegiance, and that allegiance is to shareholders and bottom line. Their job is to create products that sell. That's what they do. They're a business. They're not, their business is to help, they say, but, there we go again with what we can rightly ask, is that a slogan? Or is that really what you guys do? And, these drug companies want to sell as much of their products as possible, especially the ones that they have invested research and development funds in. So you've got to ask, when they're not being forthcoming about what's, when you have a study in which you're claiming that you claim proves that your drug actually helps people with HIV live longer, healthier lives, and that study's never been published anywhere. It's comparing groups of people it's a bit of a scientific free-for-all. You don't even know the name of the drug. I mean, whose benefit is this in? Whose best interests are being served? Is it mine and yours, or is it shareholder profit and bottom line? I think those are really important questions to ask. We don't tend to think too far beyond headlines, what authority figures tell us. And when you ask specifically about the gay community, anytime you get a group of people who are to a certain extent marginalized, who don't enjoy the same freedoms and place at the table, so to speak, as we assume other people in our society do, it's easier to I think it's easier to convince those people of the power of authority and to agree with things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense. And I think it's sad, but it's true. I think that it's easier to victimize victims. And I think in our current society, in today's world, to a certain extent, as much as I wish it were not true, we're not all treated equally. And here in Los Angeles, we enjoy a certain amount of liberty and equality, but that certainly isn't the case throughout the country. And I think that's a good question to ask, is why are people so willing to believe this is true? And I think that when you've convinced people by the way they're treated, 50, 60 years ago, being gay was considered by the American Medical Association to be a disease. And that could be treated with a lobotomy or electric shock therapy. It wasn't all that long ago that the American Medical Association took being gay out of the category of disease. It's you know, so I think it's a little easier to suggest to people who aren't sure of who they are and how they fit in and if the way they're being and living is right or wrong, that they've done something that's made them diseased, and you know, now we're going to tell you how to take care of it. I think it's really sad. I also think it's sad in developing areas of the world like Africa. You know, these people know. I just read not too long ago a quote from Peter Piot, who is, I think he's in charge of the UN AIDS program. He said he was in Malawi, and he asked the people there, he said anytime he goes to any country and talks to people about HIV and AIDS, he asks them, what do you most want? What do you most need? And they said, we don't want testing, we don't want drugs, we don't want condoms, we don't want awareness, we want food. We want food. Yet, those same people can be convinced, apparently, that the best thing for them is they should all line up to take these tests, and then they should rally around the cry for drugs. But I wonder, if you look back on the history of this, very early on, the activist groups, which were comprised mostly of gay men who were the primary people being affected by this whole thing back then, very quickly the drug companies started funding their activist activities. So the cry, you know, treatment into bodies, the whole thing to get things fast-tracked, the protease inhibitor drugs, which we just took a look at with all their inability to protect people from disease and their amazing list of side effects, which we didn't even go into. You know, muscle wasting, vomiting, fatigue, psychosis, sleep disorders, tingling of the tongue, loss of appetite, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, bone death, officially called bone necrosis, caused by these drugs, liver failure, kidney stones, blood toxicities, on and on and on. You know, what was I saying? it's you know, we've managed to, the activist groups became the rallying cry of the drug industry, and to a certain extent they're one and the same. They're one and the same. The most vociferous group in South Africa, trying to oust the president, who suggested, you know, this whole HIV/AIDS thing doesn't add up. Where are the hard numbers? You know, you guys have these predictions and estimates. Where are the hard numbers? Treatment Action Campaign is all over this president like a cheap suit. Get him out of office. Get the health minister out of office. Shut down the traditional healers that are offering people healthy alternatives to these toxic drugs. Who are they funded by? The drug companies. They're not even called AIDS activists anymore. They're treatment activists. That should be a flashing sign. There's no more AIDS activists. They're treatment activists. So it's a unified voice. My husband and I were at our attorney's office the other day, and he picked up a copy of Harper's Magazine from 2004, and they had an article called "The AIDS Rebel." And my husband thought, oh, is that going to be about, you know, the president of South Africa? Is it going to be about my wife? You know, what is this article? It's about a guy with Treatment Action Group. And what does he want? Drugs. I mean, how... Cheaper drugs. Yes, cheaper drugs. How conformist is that? That's not a rebel. That's a conformist. That's an industrialist. That's somebody speaking on behalf of the multinational chemical corporations. Yet... you know, the liberal left and all these people who say that, you know, they don't want the multinational chemical corporations to take over the world with their harmful agendas that don't take into consideration the goodness of, you know, people's lives and all this kind of stuff, are all into AIDS and HIV drugs, as they're called. Commercial interests are definitely part of the problem here. And it's also our collective inability or challenge to say, all this time, all these years, all these lives, all these billions and billions of dollars, can we just stop a second and go back to the very beginning and make sure we've got this right? I mean, that is so hard to do.
People are so invested in the lie that they can't possibly.
People don't even know it's a lie. I mean, you know, it's not so much a lie as business as usual. I mean, having been in business for a long time, I was in advertising for a long time, and then I had this very successful clothing company. The business of a business is to be in business. You need to find new markets. You need to find new customers. You need to increase your profit margins. If that means going offshore, if that means, taking over new territories, if it means coming up with new products that more people want. And the ideal of every business is to have a government mandate for your product. What just happened with HIV tests? The government said every person in America from ages 13 to 64 needs to get one of these. Why? Has AIDS gone up? No. It's been doing nothing but decline in this country since 1993, and that's after the expanded definition, which made AIDS not even about being sick. In 1993, they changed the definition to include women by the inclusion of cervical uterine cancer and people who aren't sick. And when they did that, the number of AIDS cases increased overnight and have been dropping ever since. I want to show you the chart in the book just to give that some visual reference. Here it is. Look what happened in 93 when they changed the definition of AIDS. It really wasn't happening. They expanded the category of things that could be called AIDS. Whoops, it rose just precipitously, literally overnight, and it's been going down ever since. So why this whole urge, this whole push, this whole program to test everyone with a test that's non-specific, that hasn't been validated, that nobody's claiming actually tests for the virus? Nobody can point to a validation study, and it's backed up by a viral load test, or so it's called, that says it can't confirm the presence of HIV, and was recently deflated in the worldwide media for not even being a good predictive tool. It's quite a mess. There's a new study that just came out about, they called it neuro-AIDS, which is short for neurocognitive impairment allegedly caused by, quote, HIV disease, the virus that no test can tell you is there. And they got, I think it was a $60 million grant to study the effects of HIV in the brain. Gee, we can't even find it in the blood with tests, and now we're studying it in the brain. And this is all about a condition called neuro-AIDS that deteriorates your ability to think properly. They said it happens to about 25% of HIV positives, without distinguishing if this happens to people designated positive who are on the drugs or off the drugs. It's just over and over again the same obvious errors being made, but because in 1987 a rallying group, specifically one of the biggest players in this was AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research, lobbied to have it be considered unethical to do any more placebo-controlled studies once AZT was approved. AZT was approved in 1987, 1986, 87. No more placebo-controlled studies since. And what have we learned about AZT in these years? That the study that was supposed to be a placebo-controlled study wasn't. It took place at a bunch of different hospitals all across the country, but the placebo groups they were trading drugs with the treated groups. Some people in the placebo groups got a hold of a couple capsules, took it to underground labs, had similar chemical compounds made, because everybody was afraid. They thought if they didn't get the drug, they were going to die. It was such a desperate situation. They had to transfuse the people in the treatment group to keep them alive, to finish the study. They called the study when there were more deaths in the placebo group, which wasn't really a placebo group, than the treated group. And after they called it, they kept tracking, and the placebo group and the treatment group started matching. And then the treatment group surpassed the placebo group in deaths in the long term. Well, there are studies that show that all these drugs cause mitochondrial toxicities. Mitochondria, I can best describe it as the body's, it's your cellular energy factories. It's really what keeps you alive. And these drugs cause toxicities to the mitochondria, which is the very thing you need to stay alive. They also have found that in children who receive these drugs in utero, because their mom was taking them while the mother was pregnant, and in young kids, they're suffering from DNA mutations. Ask anybody in cancer research what a DNA mutation means, and they'll say cancer. So, and then what do we have in the AIDS defining category? Cancer, lymphoma. You know, it's a circular, messed up mess of a mess. This is a great question. He said, why do people get angry about people like you who raise these questions? And my answer was, I don't know, because they're so angry they won't tell me. And then he said, do they get angry about other stuff? Yeah, it's interesting. Normally, my photocopier can't handle the number of copies it takes to include that in the little discussion, but I try to bring with me another article from People magazine. It's an expert in vitamin D deficiency. We get our vitamin D from the sun. And when you're vitamin D deficient, you can develop cancer and diabetes and other serious health problems. And this guy has studied vitamin D deficiency his entire career. And he recently published a book about it. And in his book, he made the following statement. Depending on where you live and your skin type, 10 to 15 minutes a day of direct sunlight will prevent a vitamin D deficiency. I mean, okay, right? Do you know how many people got pissed? He was fired from the university where he was teaching. He was barred from his dermatological association. His book was ridiculed. Activist sunburn, activist groups, the SPF 63, I don't know, activists came after this guy like you wouldn't believe. And there's another weird thing that's going on with regard to that whole notion that we need to constantly be covered in sunblock. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember when all those same companies made suntan lotion to attract more sun your way. Now they all make the sun blocks to keep it away. And somehow that's pretty much been mandated, like at my son's school even, and we go to a pretty alternative private school, pack the sunblock. It's like, no. He'll wear a hat or stand in the shade if necessary. That kid's never had sunblock on in his entire life. We've been to Hawaii several times, South Africa. He's never had a sunburn because we're sensible about how we approach the sun, which has been shining over the earth for billions of years and sustains life. Why is it now our enemy? It's, all these things, we're such a fear-based culture. We're such a fear-based culture, and I think that gets down to your question is why do people get mad when I raise these questions? I think they're afraid of having to really look at this and having to think of some clear answers to these questions. I mentioned when I first got here that I was out in New England and I spoke at this Concord School of Philosophy and Literature. They wanted me to engage in what they called a conversation, like in medieval times, not the restaurant, but that actual period of time. There was a kind of a discourse that people would engage in to get to the truth, scholars and students, where you would have people that had opposing views on the same topic. And they would go back and forth. One of them would state their view or opinion or facts, and the other one would listen, would repeat it as they heard it. The other person would have a chance to correct that and say, no, you haven't heard me correctly. The other person would try again, and when they had it right, they would say, okay, I've heard you and understand you. Now listen to me. And they would go back and forth and trying to get out of that, trying to distill some truth and some points of common agreement. That's the classic conversation that's used in philosophy. I think Plato or somebody Greek started that whole thing. You tell how well educated I am, right? But anyway, they wanted someone to engage in that sort of a conversation with me. And they tried inviting a couple of AIDS activists who have harshly criticized me in the media. One who wrote a New York Times op-ed piece about me, who was a speaker at the recent International AIDS Conference and stood up there and, Christine Maggiore and her husband who made that film, and they should be this, and they should keep them out of the media. He wouldn't show up to engage in a conversation with yours truly. I don't have a degree in anything. Nothing at all. Why would anybody be that afraid of me? I was invited to speak at the University of Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, which has a very well-respected, very large AIDS research facility. And I was invited by the communications department, the debate team. And I said, are you sure you guys want me? And they're like, yeah, the students really want you. I'm like, okay. You know, when I go to a place like that, I just always say to myself, well, it's a good day to die. We'll see what happens. You know, I don't know what's going to happen. They couldn't find anybody to debate me. No one at the University of Pittsburgh there from their AIDS research department would debate me. So they had to fly some guy in from Los Alamos in New Mexico who's an HIV genetic researcher who, bless his heart, was so esoteric and boring, I didn't even really have to try that hard to get through to the audience and get people, you know, Christine, then I got a question. You know, at the end he said, oh, you know, you had every advantage. I'm like, yeah, give me, come on, it's ridiculous. And I can think of a couple instances, too, where they tried to film me on ABC's 2020 with the head of AMFAR, the organization that made it so that a placebo-controlled study is considered unethical. Not only would the president or vice chancellor, whatever you call her, the head of AMFAR, Dr. Matilda Krim, not only would she not meet with me in person, she would not be photographed with me or let them shoot B-roll, which is, you know, you strolling along and all that kind of stuff. She wouldn't even meet off camera for lunch. What is up with that? They invited another guy to this Concord School of Philosophy to engage in this conversation with me, who's written extensively about me. And I got to see the email where he declined. He said, you know, it's dangerous to have her there. She's dangerous, and she'll do damage, and then I'll have to clean up the damage. And I think, well, okay, if I'm dangerous, come stop me. Come stop me. And you know, there's nothing to clean up after that. Well, you know, she'll say that HIV was discovered at a press conference, that it wasn't discovered in a lab. Well, if it was, just come with the studies that show that it was. You know, come with the validation studies for the HIV test. Come with the one test that is actually approved for diagnosing actual infection with HIV. Just come with that. You know, I'm ready to retire any time. I don't make any money at this. You know, I'd rather be home reading or something, no offense. I mean, it's really sad that it's gotten down to that point where you have to name call. You have to name call, because you can't say what it is that I'm doing or saying of this information that is dangerous. And then after he said the dangerous and she'll do damage, then he said, you know, too, is she really gets them by the heart. You know, she really grabs them in. It's just silly. I mean, if what I'm saying is wrong, please come and correct me. I talked with a professor of, actually his class is in the biology of AIDS at the University of North Florida, and every couple of years he writes a textbook on the biology of AIDS. And to me it would be like a fairy tale book. But I found out through a guy who photographed me for a magazine that he was sniffing around to get a photograph of me to put in his most recent text. So I knew that he wanted to say something more about me than he usually says in his text if he's putting in a photograph. So the photographer gave me his email address and put me in touch with him. And I said, you know, I understand that you're going to write something about me, and I hope you've based what you're going to write on some factual stuff and not just, you know, an LA Times story or here or there. And if you need any help, I'm here. And I said, I hope your textbook will answer 4 outstanding questions that I would love to see answered, and I'd be ready to, you know, stop what I'm doing, all this dangerous activity I'm engaging in. So happy to stop. And I listed those questions. Did I ever hear back from him? No. When I called him, what did he do? He hung up on me. I've sent that same list of questions, I don't know how many times, to how many researchers, and now I tell my son I'm magic. I can make people disappear. All I have to do is send an email with a few questions. Boom, they're just gone after that. So it's you know, sad. It's a real sad situation, because only by engaging in that back and forth, only by confronting, you know, what we think we understand with the questions about what we think we understand, do we get to some core of what's really going on. And the guy who spoke about me specifically at this last International AIDS Conference said the media shouldn't let these people have a voice. You shouldn't even print a letter to the editor from these people. Not even that. That's how dangerous they are. I mean, that is a real sad state. You know, here we are in America. That's well, I guess that doesn't mean as much as it used to. Yeah, I think if the internet had been around when this first started happening, it couldn't have gotten this far. I think it would have been stopped before it became like a giant, locomotive going at 2 billion miles an hour that now is so hard to stop. People would not have been so invested.
People don't want to be wrong. I mean, they
Yeah. Well, it's embarrassing to be wrong.
in this thing, and they aren't going to.
Oh, it's so. It's. I mean.
Don't want to know they've been killing people.
Yeah. Well, think about the little things in your life where it's embarrassing to be wrong. My husband goes to the market with a list of stuff, and then he'll forget half of it, and I'll go, well, what about they were out. He never wants to say, I'm sorry, I forgot to get that. And so, they were out this week. But, I know. It's so hard to say you're wrong for the small things. I'm sorry for the little things. And plus, we live in such a litigious society. You say you're wrong, you're sued. You made a mistake, you're in trouble now. So, and part of that language in those tests is to protect the companies who make them from being sued when they're used improperly. Those are very carefully constructed sentences. And I would recommend, if you guys haven't picked up, there's a paper over there that has some internet resources for looking more into this controversy. It's pretty much the same as on the links page at our website, but some people do better when it's in print, so I brought that. And I also brought that, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago at a group called Atheists United. And there are people who don't believe in God and believe in rationality, and their newspaper is called Rational Alternatives, and they're known as free thinkers. You should have seen how pissed they got at me. It was unbelievable. I've had a better response speaking. One day I did a talk on Christian radio, and then later that day I spoke at an anarchist convention. And in both places my talks went really well. The atheists, they went nuts. It started a whole controversy, fighting with the people on the board. Should we have her back to do a talk or not? No, this is a discounted point of view, popular opinion. So I wrote him back and I said, popular opinion says God exists.
By being atheist.
Exactly. I mean, what's the vested interest of atheists in AIDS? The only thing I can figure out is every year this particular group of atheists participates in the AIDS Walk for APLA. It's their way of showing, even though we're atheists, we care and we're good people. We don't need God to guide us on how to be good, caring people. And I kind of wrecked that a little bit by suggesting maybe this is worthy of their rational thinking and their exploration. So, our vested interests don't necessarily have to be money, or, people are bad or evil. I went around for AIDS Project Los Angeles and preached the gospel of AIDS. I was a public speaker and an educator. I believed it. I believed I was doing good. I also believed I was going to die like they told me, 5 to 7 years. It'll be 15 years in January, and like I said at the beginning, I've never taken any AIDS drugs, and I really don't see why I would. I've enjoyed, since testing positive, the best health of my life. When I was growing up, I was always little skinny Chrissy, and I was always sick. I talked with my best friend from elementary school. We were in Girl Scouts together, and our Girl Scout troop got stuck in a snowstorm, an unexpected, unseasonal snowstorm. And she said, remember how I gave you my jacket, because I knew if you didn't have a jacket, you were going to get sick. So I gave you my jacket, I got sick, and then you got sick anyway. I mean, that's the kind of kid I was. I was always sick. Here I've been positive almost 15 years. I've been around without knowing I was at the time, because I certainly don't court these sorts of meetings. People with tuberculosis. I knowingly took care of someone last year, well, actually it was January of this year, with severe pneumonia. We didn't even know it was bacterial, fungal, whatever. I mean, the guy was really, really sick, but he needed a place to stay. I don't put that offer out to everyone. But he needed a place to stay, and so we took him into our home and we took care of him for a couple of weeks. I didn't get sick, my husband didn't get sick, my son didn't get sick, but he sure was sick. And I was even cleaning his blood up off the floor because he had a nurse coming in and giving him injections. I don't go out looking for those situations, but, if you're supposed to be immune suppressed, I used to get cold sores all the time. I think my mouth is scarred from how often I used to get those. Then I tested positive, and I changed my diet, and I changed the way I live. I don't get cold sores. I've lived through a year of just unbelievable stress this past year with this ongoing police investigation and everything associated with it. I haven't even gotten a cold sore. I mean, I'm not trying to ask for one, but, it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense in my life. It doesn't make sense in so many lives I see around me. It doesn't make sense in the medical literature.
I have a question. What is an HIV test actually measuring in reality that you can...
Depending on the kind of test it is, what is an HIV test measuring in reality? If it's an antibody test, it's probably looking for antibody response to certain proteins that are thought to be associated with HIV, but none of them are unique or specific to HIV. If it's a viral load test, it's looking for certain genetic materials, RNA or DNA, that's thought to be associated with HIV. But again, these things are constructed from materials that haven't come from a purified isolate of HIV. Therefore, the proteins and the genetic material are not specific to anything called HIV. So they're looking for indirect representatives.
Rather than a causative factor, could they be debris as a result?
It could be. It could be. Some researchers have tried to find some kind of value or meaning in HIV tests. And they say, well, when they're positive in people from risk groups, they do have some predictive value in telling us who will become sick. But it's kind of a weird thing to be doing, to take a test that doesn't do what it's said to be doing, that doesn't test for any specific virus or representative of it, and try to find something that it might be doing that's helpful.
And then you can't
Why bother?
whether those people are on
Yeah,
or not.
yeah. I don't understand, but they have done some study into that and have graciously acknowledged that it does seem to have some predictive value in people who come from acknowledged risk groups. But why you're trying to assign value to a misguided test, I really don't understand. But it's interesting anyway. Well, does anybody have any further thoughts or ideas they want to discuss? Or
I just kind of want to know, do you still get your tests as far as T-cell?
I haven't done those in a long time. I would do them, except they're really expensive. They're very, very expensive. I mean, last time I looked at it, a T-cell test was like, $300, $400. I would do it. Well, also too, I hate blood tests. I'm a baby. I'll admit it. I would do it if they weren't. I would still do it, even though I hate them, if they weren't so expensive, just to see what happens, because I think it's really interesting. And I'll tell you one thing about the last time I went and had a viral load test done. I was being filmed for, it was back when they were doing that 2020 show, and they wanted me to go on camera and take an HIV test, so-called HIV test, to prove that I actually test positive, because certain activists say that I'm not, that I just do this because, I want new friends or something. I like eating chips on Wednesday nights far from home. But I agreed to do that, and we went to a little testing lab over by my house on Sepulveda Boulevard. And they had this menu that they called it, and you could order, from the menu. So I ordered antibody test, and I took a side of viral load. And I handed it to the lady, and she looked at it, and she said, oh, this is going to be a problem. I said, why? She said, well, we can't give you the viral load test until you've tested positive. I said, well, I have. She said, no, until you test positive on an antibody test here. I said, why do I have to do that? She said, well, just a minute. So she went and got the medical director, and the cameras are rolling. So this guy walks out, and he's combing his hair. It was so funny. And he sits down, and he goes, this is a problem. People come here, and they want to take a viral load test because they've heard that it takes maybe 6 weeks to develop antibodies after exposure, and they want to know right now if they've got the virus or not. So they come here, and they ask for a viral load test. They'll test positive for a viral load. They'll think they're infected. They'll go home and tell their wife. Everybody freaks out. And then we get the antibody test result back, and they're negative. So it's a real problem. So
what's the viral load test counting?
Well, he said, I said, well, So what did you do? Well, we don't let people who haven't tested antibody positive take the viral load test because too many people were coming back with a positive viral load that were antibody negative. And I said, so let me summarize what I think you're saying. You're saying that when somebody who's negative has a viral load, that's a mistake. And when somebody who's positive has a viral load, that's virus. He goes, yeah, you got it.
On camera?
And then, of course, they never used that. Yeah, they never used that part. But isn't that silly? I mean, if you have a test where people who don't have the condition are testing for a viral load of this, so-called disease-causing entity, well, you should be giving that test to more people who don't have it to see what the heck is wrong with your test. Not allowing people to take the test so they can't skew your important results there. It's the whole system is just something that really, really needs critical evaluation. And I'm glad you're here tonight. Before I came here, I was talking a good long time on the phone with a group of graduate students in Italy who are trying to get a debate together over there, and I connected them up with people. I talk to people all over the world all the time. People are ordering the documentary that you guys saw all over the world all the time. It was just recently dubbed into a Spanish language version that will be ready soon. That was a donation from a supporter in Mexico who owns a record company and a television studio and just donated a dub with 30 actors and the Foley all put in. It was amazing. But there's people, I had somebody from the equivalent of PBS in Japan ask for a screening copy. Al Jazeera television network, the one that is probably the largest viewership in the world in the Arab nations, asked for a screening copy for their documentary channel to show this. There's a lot of interest from around the world, but it just doesn't factor into the mainstream media acknowledging this interest because there's a larger vested interest. And as you know, it's going to be the people that care about coming to the truth and the facts about this that lead the way for the people who are supposed to be leading us, because I feel they've led us astray to a certain extent.
Also, I was reading there was something, I forgot the source, but it had to do with gay men testing positive for HIV and connecting it with what was it, drug?
Crystal meth. Yeah.
And so they were all able to make it all come together on this.
Well, it's interesting because that group of researchers who say this test has some predictive value, they say it's really responding to blood that's oxidated, that's stressed in an oxidative sense, and crystal meth does that. Crystal meth has also been shown on its own to deplete T-cell counts. They say that crystal meth is dangerous because it impairs your ability to put on a condom or, remember that you're supposed to be doing that. But crystal meth is in and of itself very dangerous. I mean, I've never used it or tried it, but I know several people. As a matter of fact, there's a really great group down in San Diego. I'm going to see them this weekend that are starting a positive, healthy, not taking meds, dating and friendship site. And these are a bunch of guys that are in recovery programs, mostly from crystal meth. And some of them are gay and some of them are straight. But, I mean, it's fascinating to me how far astray you can go using that stuff. This one guy was married, had a lovely wife and a beautiful kid, really handsome, healthy guy. He was selling himself to men on the street to get enough, to keep himself in enough crack and meth. It's just remarkable how, it does more than impair your judgment about condoms. It really can, destroy your life. And he, the whole time he was using, went surfing all the time and ate a great diet and took vitamins and minerals. And he said he's not the only one in his group that's positive, went on serious drug runs for long periods of time, has never taken any anti-HIV drugs, as they're called, and is fine. Another friend of mine told me something, too. I never knew that he had a drug problem. And would have been nice to know because he stayed at our house. But he's in New York, and he said that he recognized a while ago that he had a drug problem, and he went into recovery. He recognized he had a drug problem finally when he had 2 AIDS-defining illnesses and a treatment-resistant staph infection, and he tested HIV negative. And he decided that he was the living embodiment of this idea that you can do things to your immune system that put you in that category of AIDS without even being HIV positive. And he got into this recovery group, and he said, it's funny, Christine, because there are so many AIDS rethinkers in this recovery group who don't even know they're AIDS rethinkers. They're positive, healthy, not taking the meds, and they're in recovery. And every time they go off and they start binging, their viral load shoots up and their T cells go down, or they're just plain sick. They stop abusing and eat and take care of themselves, and they're fine again. He said most of these guys are not taking any anti-HIV meds, as they're called, and they're HIV positive, and they've really, pushed things to a certain limit, and they're fine. They're fine. Another thing I want to point out to you, too, there's a couple new websites that have come up that if you go to the news and updates section on our website, you'll find out about. There's it's under the headline, Now Hear This. There's podcasts of interviews with me, with scientists and doctors who are raising these questions, and something called Living Healthy Without HIV Drugs, I think is the name of it. And each week it's an interview with someone who's HIV positive, healthy, and being that way without taking the drugs, just because we have to have a voice, because the media isn't giving us one. AIDS organizations won't even let people like me participate and speak up. Many people have contacted me over the years, and they've said, Christine, I'm positive, and I'm healthy, and I'm not taking the drugs, and I feel like I can tell my story and give people hope. So they contact their local AIDS organizations, and without question, I have never heard once of an AIDS organization saying, gee, that's a great story to share. They say, I'm sorry, you send the wrong message. Because they're not taking the drugs. The message should be hope, health, humanity, but it's the wrong message, apparently, in this paradigm. Well, if there was a virus that we could look at under an electron microscope and say, aha, there's HIV, that might be a reasonable idea to explore. But what's interesting, too, about HIV tests, they're not testing for the virus, and they've never been validated by the finding of the virus. And most viral antibody tests are run on what they call straight serum or neat serum. That's, serum without being diluted. Some are diluted 1 to 10, or whichever way I express it, 10 to 1 and so forth, maybe up to 30 maybe. This particular test, you need to dilute the serum over 300 times. Why is that? Because if you test straight serum or neat serum, everybody tests positive, apparently. Of course, this experiment was never funded, but a doctor I know, he's an infectious disease specialist who works at the testing lab at Cornell Medical University in New York. And he got curious about this dilution rate. Why do you have to, thanks guys, dilute an HIV test over 300 times? When these other viral antibody tests don't use such a high dilution rate, and there's no reference in the test kit to anything in the medical literature that would explain that. So after hours, he took people's serum that had tested HIV negative and ran a test without diluting at all. And these negative people tested positive every single time. So whatever it is in those tests, apparently we all have it. It's just that some people have more of it than others, enough of it than others to make a positive reaction. And another thing I learned, too, in the film you guys saw, there's that one scientist, Rodney Richards. He was a founding scientist at Amgen Laboratories, and they created the first HIV antibody test under contract from Abbott. This test we looked at, the EIA, that was created at Abbott Laboratories, and he was part of the team that did that. He said that when they were developing this test, they started getting really worried because they were taking groups of healthy blood donors. People had given their blood year after year after year, and way too many of them were testing positive on this test before they refined it, before they calibrated it. They had to calibrate it so that not too many people would test positive inexplicably, that they would come from low risk or no risk groups and test positive. So they made it so enough people who had what they were calling the risk factors would test positive, but not too many who didn't have risk factors would test positive. And you catch a few here that you don't mean to, and you miss a few here that you'd like to, and there's a compromise.
People got misdiagnosed, like at a, was a clinic.
In San Francisco, that happened recently too, where they were doing one of the oral rapid tests, and they called a bunch of people positive who were not, and they said, oh, well, that's because they had hepatitis B or were vaccinated for it, and that can cause one of those cross reactions that's listed on that brochure. But, I'm a full-time mom. I work, and I do this, and, I'm a volunteer at school, and I have a life. I like to eat and go to the movies. So it's kind of hard, and we don't have funding. We don't have all those billions of dollars that the other guys have. But anytime anybody has a good idea, I'm all ready to listen. And if you're able to help with the good idea, that's even better. Like Sandra here, if you don't mind my pointing out, I've got 2 cartons of my book in Spanish that she's going to take down to Mexico and distribute to people. And there's people doing stuff like that all the time, and sending links out in these new audio cast and video cast websites where people can hear this. My husband just made a 20-minute version of The Other Side of AIDS that you can watch for free on, I think it's something. It's on iTunes. Maybe it is iTunes. You can watch it on YouTube and maybe Google Video. So, more and more of this stuff is getting out, but I would love to do so much more than what I'm doing. And a friend of mine and I are talking about doing a podcast where we take AIDS news and analyze it and talk about it and poke at it and poke fun at it and, share the facts with people. But he works too, he's an actor and a singer and a waiter and, everything else he needs to be. But, I want to do that. And I just love, like, the guy that I met in San Diego, that I'm going to see his group this weekend. He's the one who's setting up that dating and friendship website for HIV positives. He's somebody who called me and said, I just got this diagnosis and they say I'm going to die, and I saw your website. And little by little he comes around, and now he's reaching out to help people. So a lot of times, it starts with visiting the website, and then people find their own way to help somebody else. And
People decide to stop taking medications, like, where do they start? What do they do? What do they take besides what are the alternative therapies?
It depends on the individual. Our tendency in this culture is to treat everybody the same. It depends on the person. I mean, some people come into being HIV positive after, 20 years of drug use. They're going to be a lot different than a 20-year-old college student who just tests positive for some strange reason. Their needs are going to be distinctly different. But unfortunately, the medical care system says, oh, you're positive? Well, we treat you the same. We do your T cells, we do your viral load, and here's the choice of drugs for you. Yeah, and they don't really look at you as an individual, and that's really the key to health, is what are your needs? What are your needs? Just because maybe we both test positive doesn't mean we have the same needs. I don't know how you absorb your vitamin C. You don't know how I absorb mine. I mean, do you need more protein than I do? I don't know. You need help in determining what's good for you. And also, too, one thing that gets lost in all of this that I want to emphasize, and then I got to shut up and eat dinner and go home, is that we talked about this when I was at the philosophy school, because this is the kind of thing you can talk about at a philosophy school. I really believe that in all of this we've lost our inner authority, that knowingness that we have. I was told I was going to die, and everything about my life was telling me that wasn't true. I was out playing tennis, I'm healthy, doing all kinds of things, and I was told I was going to die in 5 to 7 years, that I had this insidious virus floating around in my body, replicating billions of times even before I could finish saying the sentence, and destroying me little by little. That information defied how I felt inside and how my health was. Yet I chose to believe the authority outside of myself, even though it didn't make sense with what I was experiencing and what I really felt to be true. I only believed that authority for a short time, thank goodness, because it really didn't make sense to me, and then I found the information to really convince me it didn't make sense. But in all of this, we lose our perspective that we have an inner authority, and we have other ways of giving authority to our perceptions about ourselves. Somebody, I forget who it was that was here the last time, his doctor told him, they always pick a holiday. You're going to be dead by Christmas. They always got to pick a holiday. And that's because he stopped taking the drugs. They were making him so sick. And this guy's in his 20s. He's a really vibrant, healthy young man. He's married and has 2 kids. They say he's been positive at least 10 years according to his T-cell count, but his wife isn't positive. The kids aren't positive. And she had their second child right after he was diagnosed positive and told, he was very, very sick when he wasn't feeling that way. He finally had to make a decision between that authority telling him what was going to happen based on this very capricious, non-specific test and a T-cell count, and the way he felt. And so far he's chosen to go with the way he feels, the fact that he's not getting sick, the fact that he's gaining weight, the fact that he goes to work and everybody has the flu but he doesn't, the fact that he can go to the gym and work out. And he's planning on, making it through Christmas, but that's hard to go against that authority, and the authority has come down to these lab markers, and it's not even about how you are, it's what are your numbers. So, at the School of Philosophy, we talked about that voice that lets call it intuition. Some people call it the little inner voice or the thing you hear when everything's quiet. I think that we need to pay attention to that. You can't give it a name, and it's different for everybody, but I think there's something to be said in listening. So with that in mind, will you stop listening to me? And thank you very much for being here this evening.